An argument that you might sometimes hear brought up against Christianity is that their beliefs somehow are correct, but the beliefs of all these cultures that came before them are just completely wrong. And so, how do they know that they've got it right? And so, you could point to things like the Greek mythology and the Norse mythology and these different mythologies and pantheons of gods and say, how come those are mythologies, but the Christian stories in the Old Testament are not? And what I'm actually going to say is that those mythologies and the characters in them are not entirely false. And so this is a little bit more complex than just saying, like, actually all that stuff happened and also all the stuff in the Christian Bible happened, but that these mythologies are not just fake, but actually intentionally false and intentional falsifications. This idea is not my own, but it's something that I think has been lost in our modern culture, and I really think it's important to talk about. And one of those important aspects is that in modern Christianity, we have really lost this idea of spirituality and the spiritual battle that we're in. I think a lot of pastors and a lot of Christians and a lot of people are afraid to go into that because now we live in this world of science and technology, and it's impossible to consider that there are these spiritual realms of ghosts and spirits and angels and demons and all of this magical hooey that nobody believes in anymore. And nobody wants to be the one to say that. And you'll see this with mainline denominations in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, where you have priests that believe that miracles and magic and spirituality is metaphorical and allegorical and isn't actually the case. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about why I think that's wrong and about a specific viewpoint. Now, there's more to be said about this in the future, and I think that there's more conversations to be had on spirituality. And on this one, we're zoning in specifically on the idea of the principalities and powers in the Old and New Testaments and how they correlate to these mythological stories that you've heard about or may have heard about before. So if that sounds interesting to you, please stick around and hear what we have to say. And if you're interested in following along the channel, please consider liking, subscribing, or commenting down below to let me know what you think of this video. So without further ado, let's get into it. One thing that you might notice is a lot of commonalities in mythological stories. So these hierarchies of gods and these things that we have are not altogether unique. And of course, obviously the Romans just copied their stories from the Greeks. But beyond that, you have the Norse pantheons and the Greek pantheons sharing, certain similar stories, certain similar concepts. We have trickster gods, we have this kind of like powerful all-father god, we have rebellious gods, we have gods that have power over things like thunder and lightning and different types of weather, we have gods of the seasons, and this goes back all the way to Egyptian, Canaanite, Babylonian gods, and you see these, and it even echoes through to the Bible. And when we're talking about what you might call Jewish mythology or Jewish Christian or Judeo-Christian mythology, you'd be talking about these types of commonalities. And among those are these large pantheons of these lowercase g gods who fight for each other, who have sexual relations with one another, who engage in this disturbing type of behavior, who are rude and mean to humans, or some of them who care about humans. And there's all kinds of kind of complications and things going on. And when we're talking about these, it's interesting to note that that doesn't make them automatically disaligned with one another. So when we get into certain stories, you'll be able to see those commonalities. I'd say a very specific one that everyone probably knows is the commonalities between flood stories across the world. So this is one of the evidences that I use to support this thought, which is that every culture, essentially every culture, has a flood, an ancient flood story where the entire earth or a portion of the earth is flooded, and then a remnant of people are the ones who survive the flood. And that, to me, signals a commonality between all these cultures. So a lot of people look at this and say that that just must be, everybody has this idea for some reason. And people don't like to look and say, what if that's actually coming from a common story that is twisted and, plays the telephone game? And so we end up with these kind of incongruous ideas of it now. And that is the essential idea that I'm going to support. There's one reason too why I think the flood narrative is actually, from a Christian perspective, the last narrative that we get that is really the most in common with all cultures. So all the cultures might have this idea of like a hierarchy of rebellious gods, and they have this. They have a creation epic typically, and they have like a flood or global destruction and remnant epic. And then after that is where you get into a lot of the differences. And the reason for that, I think, is because the flood story is the last story before cultures are dramatically separated. So in the Jewish scriptures or in the Christian Old Testament, in the flood narrative, after the land and the remnant of Noah's family survives, it is a few generations after that where we have the Tower of Babel event. And the Tower of Babel event is the one that we're going to be focusing on the most importantly today. So at the Tower of Babel event, first of all, it says that the people are scattered across the earth because they are becoming too powerful, and they build what is commonly conceived to be a ziggurat, which is a sort of religious structure that's built to have contact with God or the heavens. And so they're becoming too oppressive, and they say basically we're going to build up to the heavens. Some interpretations say they're trying to fight God, or they're trying to confront God, or they're trying to make themselves into gods. The idea portrayed in the Old Testament, I believe in the exact passages, let us make for us this tower so that we cannot be lost across all the earth, so that, no matter where we are, we can look and we can see this great tower, and we can know this incredible achievement of humanity and what we're capable of. And God wants to challenge their humanity, and so he scatters and he says, let's confuse first their languages, and then let's scatter them to the four winds all across the earth. Now, if we take that literally, you don't have to. There's a lot of ways it could be interpreted. By scatter, he could just mean specifically that he made all these people confused, and then they all got mad at each other, and then they all left and went their separate ways and went across the earth. Now, I happen to think that it might be more mystical than that, personally. I think it aligns with the spirituality aspect. But you get this idea, then, that people are scattered all across the earth. And if it happens supernaturally, then it makes sense for us to then have Native Americans who are mystically transported over to the North American continent and the South American continent, and to have people who are transported over into the Orient, and to have people that are transported all across the middle areas. And then they all have these different ideas of flood epics because it's either miscommunicated or purposely twisted. And I'll discuss maybe a little bit more on that as well. So if you have that being the scenario, which I think is highly likely, it actually makes sense that that would be the last story in common before they're separated to the four winds. Before people are confused in language and separated, the last common event they have is the flood. And it's a few generations after that flood, which they all would have had some kind of ancestry to, that they would then be separated across the entire world. And then at that point, the cultures become separate. Another important thing about the Babel event that I'd like to talk more about, probably in a future video when I do a review of Michael Heiser's work, which I'd really like to do. A lot of Christians, especially those who are interested in supernatural things and honestly, people who are just interested in new theology in general, have heard of Michael Heiser by this point. He's become quite popular on YouTube and has since passed away, the late Michael Heiser, I think 2 years ago or a year ago. But his work is really just incredible, and he makes a scholarly point about the division of the world at the Babel event. And there's specific scripture in the oldest translations, such as Deuteronomy 32, that points to, at this Tower of Babel event, the people of the world are scattered into different regions, and then members of the heavenly host, or the angels, are appointed to rule over those people on earth geographically. They're given control of them. Those are either members of the heavenly host before a fall, or post a fall. So there are these earthly beings who are placed over them who are corrupted. Like you have these angels that have already fallen, and now they're on earth, and God gives them these people that are not his chosen people to do with what they will. So there's two possible approaches to that, but the general idea remains the same. And from then on out, we have the pagan gods. And that's where our commonality comes in here, is that my belief, and it's not just my belief, but my belief is that these pagan gods actually represent the rebellious members of the heavenly host. And there's a great deal of evidence for this, including but not limited to the historical support for it. So some recent reading that I've been doing, and I'm trying to get into more of this specifically, but some recent reading that I've been doing, for example, is Augustine and Justin Martyr, who are two examples of people who have this perspective. And these are some of the earliest Christian converts, and they sort of reflect the idea of what maybe would have been prevalent right before them in sort of Second Temple Judaism, which is the period of time where we get a lot of literature on this subject. It also follows through from the idea of the Watchers, which is discussed in the Book of Enoch, and that's where a lot of Dr. Michael Heiser's work focuses, which is the fact that there is actually a heavenly host of angels, angelic beings. Some of them fall, and some of them are disobedient and become servants of Satan in the Christian perspective, and they're given control of geographical regions and then asked to be worshipped. And you get this right into the Exodus narrative, where we have the earliest pantheons, which are probably the Egyptian, but also the Canaanite and Babylonian gods. The Babylonian gods kind of proceed directly from the Canaanite gods. Now, there's a lot of literature that you're going to hear about this, where people are going to tell you that there was two separate Canaanite gods and they came together to form the Hebrew god and all these other gods. And from my point of view that we're discussing here today, there's a reason why all that stuff is so easily dismissed, which is that if we take the viewpoint that there is one true God and that these false pagan gods are all fallen angels who are assuming worship and stealing it away from the Lord on purpose, then why wouldn't they make up false stories, false narratives to paint false pictures and portraits of God? And the truth is that they absolutely would. I think in a lot of the cases, the stories are kind of created by humans themselves based on kind of notions provided to them by these beings. And it's interesting to me that you can start to see the commonalities between them. So as early as ancient Egypt, you have sort of the head god being Ra or Amun-Ra, who's like this light god. And it's interesting that we're told in the New Testament that Satan will be disguised as an angel of light. So, and he's often associated with the sun or with Venus being the morning star, or being associated with the first star or the son of the first star. Lucifer actually means the lighted one or something along those lines. It has to do with the light or the star. And so there's a lot of implications there. And so it's interesting to me that the head god of the Egyptian pantheon seems to be the head bad guy in the Christian pantheon. And it sort of follows through to the Greek ideas as well. What's interesting to me about like lightning and thunder gods being the most powerful often portrayed in such positive ways, it seems to me to also be indicative of this. So when you see Zeus at the head of the Greek pantheon having power over thunder and lightning, that seems to be him stealing the traditional views of El, who is God of the Old Testament, having association with sort of like thunder and storms and things like that, starting as early as in Exodus, where he appears in clouds and things like that. And some people hold that there was a Canaanite storm god who became mixed with the Hebrew god Yahweh, and that's where we get our modern interpretations. Obviously, I don't think that's correct, because in my estimation, that's a perversion, and I think that the scripture, that is the Bible, is the correct truth that was passed down to us by the one true God. And that's essentially the Christian belief, is that all this other stuff is false and this one's true, and I think it proves itself to be true by its contents. But that's a different story. That's a different conversation. I've done a minor defense of, should you believe in God and why should you believe in this one? That's a different conversation. The conversation is, once you get to that point, then how do you explain away all the rest of this stuff? And I think this is the correct way to do it. Not just by my own means, but I think it explains it the best. And I also think that historical figures have thought it explains it the best. There is a ton of, in the early church, as I mentioned, Justin Martyr is very early. Augustine is not too far after. Augustine's in the 300s, and Justin Martyr is as early as the 1s or 200s, I think, maybe 200s. I'd have to look back. But you have these very early church figures reflecting this idea, saying, you all are worshiping these pagan gods who are actually the fallen members of God's heavenly host. It's a common idea, and we've lost it in modernity because I think Satan purposely doesn't want us to know that. And like I said, because of these commonalities of a certain god of great power becoming the head god of a pantheon of gods, I mean, it really reflects sort of this one big bad angel being over all these other big bad angels who have fallen from grace and doing all these things. And you can see a lot of commonalities in their behavior. So another word for sinfulness in the modern context is hedonism. And where we get that from is from these Greek like incestual sexual practices and these just indulgences of the flesh. And that ties all the way back into the book of Enoch and the things that they taught the people of the world to do. So you have these angelic beings who come down to earth and they're teaching humans to engage in these awful kind of behaviors and to be bad people. And then you have really common those commonalities of all the things that in the Levitical law and in the Deuteronomical law of the Old Testament, God tells the Jews not to do because the other pagan people will engage in those things. And those specific things are almost all present in the ancient mythological stories. I mean, take the Greek gods, for example. It's just incest and Zeus stealing human wives all over the place. And God stealing human wives is exactly what happens prior to the biblical flood. That's most of the reason that the biblical flood happens is because these fallen angels take wives from men and then they have these demigod children, which are Nephilim. And that idea is in almost every mythology as well. And so these commonalities to me are the most interesting part, especially when you're talking about more ancient. You know, we know for a fact that sort of the Jewish canon and the Egyptian canon and Babylonian and Canaanite mythologies are very old. Of course, that makes them older than the Greek stories, which sort of rely on them, but are perhaps more prominent today. And even the Norse stories, which hold a lot of similarities to the Greek ones in many ways, though they focus a lot more on nature. And Norse mythological concepts is where we get a lot of sort of modern naturalism and that kind of stuff. I also think that these pagan worship practices migrate into what we have today in some modern kind of occult affiliated things, such as, you know, people practice paganism today in a different way. They might practice something like Wicca, which they claim is a totally innocent nature-based religion, but if you look into the origins to it, it's affiliated very closely with people who were practicing the occult and were doing so as members of societies that were involved with figures like Aleister Crowley, who's essentially the father of modern Satanism, and there's a lot of common themes there. I think there's another video that I could make that would go into the commonalities between these specific themes and things like that and how they interact with one another. Let's see here. I said about the stories. I think the stories are both in common and make sense with the nature of the two of them. And I think really that's the most important part, is like if you look at the things that are considered sinful and are considered typical of the pagan gods mentioned in the Old Testament, they match on criteria to all of the pagan practices, all the way up to the New Testament, where Jesus is specifically condemning pagan practices at places like Caesarea Philippi, which is associated with Mount Hermon, which is where the gods are released from in the book of Enoch. And there's a whole bunch of tie-ins there to these, like, pagan practices are being done at places that are explicitly connected to Judeo-Christian evil and demonicness. And so to say that those things are just separate is not true, in my opinion. I think that the reason that those people are receiving worship is to take it away from God, and that there's a lot of evidence for this. One additional evidence for this that I think is really good is the idea of Babylonian architecture reflecting the beings that are seen in Daniel and Ezekiel. So because Daniel and Ezekiel are books that come from the Babylonian exile period, you have descriptions in both of them of what is commonly regarded as, I think, the seraphim, not the cherubim. The appearance of these seraphim, cherubim, angelic beings that appear to both Daniel and Ezekiel in their books. And these beings have these are the ones when you look up like biblically accurate angels, and everybody loves to talk about biblically accurate angels. This is where you get these appearances from. These are these bilateral rings revolving around one another. They're aligned with eyes, and you have sets of wings, huge multitudes of wings. Those beings, and they have four heads of what, like man, ox, eagle, and lion, or something like that. The four-headed bestial biblically accurate angels. So when we're talking about those those depictions have been commonly associated with Babylonian architecture. We're finding references to the Babylonian gods looking like those things. And so people are saying that's debunked. That's just Daniel and Ezekiel reusing Babylonian architecture as a way to define heavenly beings. Well, here's another perspective. What if that is what divine heavenly beings look like, and the ones that are fallen, the fallen version of those divine heavenly beings, have appeared to the Babylonians and requested to be worshipped? So you have the exact same consistency there. There's no reason to believe that that's not actually what they look like, or at least what they appeared to the Babylonians to look like, and that the good versions of those angels would look exactly the same and would appear to Daniel and Ezekiel in that manner. And I think that's very indicative of that. Like I said, some support off the top of my head is in Augustine and Justin Martyr, but there's a whole bunch of early apologists that also reflect this view. There's a whole bunch of Second Temple literature that reflects this view, and there's a whole bunch of scholarly work on that Second Temple literature. And so I think a good place to get into this would be to read those church fathers, and a second step would be to evaluate Michael Heiser's work, which is what I want to do in the future. I think my biggest intention is to get into Heiser's work and talk about his spiritual worldview, because I think it's so helpful for the modern Christian who, like I said, has lost their spiritual worldview. That's the most important thing, that if you get anything out of this video, it's that the loss of the spiritual worldview is really detrimental. We need to be able to say that, demons and fallen angels and spiritual warfare is real. It's going on around us. And if people would be interested in a video talking about that specifically, then that's something I would be interested in doing, because I really think it's valuable. It's one of my great passions, is to remind people of the state of the spiritual world, that everything that goes on is spiritual, that geographical powers are in place that are doing things. It's also important to note, though, from a Christian perspective, those geographical powers have technically been defeated by Jesus. His death and resurrection is victory over those powers. It actually says that in one of Paul's letters, that is indeed the case, that he had victory over the powers at his crucifixion, and now all the nations are freed from that pagan influence and can come to him. That doesn't mean the pagan influence doesn't still exist, but it means that those people have been freed, whether of heart or of body or of mind or of literal geographical influence, or the amount of influence that those deities are permitted to have. They've now been freed of that, and so all nations, not just the Jews, have been opened up to the availability of receiving Christ Jesus. And that's sort of what that represents there, because like up at that point when Jesus came, it was just Christian or pagan. It wasn't what we have today, where you have secularist and all of this other kind of stuff going on. And even secularism, I think, is its own form of paganism. That's a different conversation entirely. So this video is just an introduction to the idea. It's saying, listen, I had this idea when I started reading Heiser, and that idea was affirmed for me when I started studying the church fathers and found that they actually believed that Augustine actually believed that the pagan gods were fallen angels, and that Justin Martyr believed the same thing, and that other church fathers believed the same thing. And it's actually a belief that was held that I think has been lost, because you don't hear anybody talking about that or teaching that, and like a good scholar will be able to tell you about how in the Exodus story, the 10 plagues actually defeat 10 major Egyptian gods. And it's showing, like, the entire illustration of the plagues is to show God being more powerful than the Egyptian gods. And we as Christians in a modern context don't like to use the lowercase g gods word, because we're kind of afraid of it, because there's only one God, right? And yeah, there is only one true God. There's all these false gods that have presented themselves as gods to be worshipped. And that's something that we should be aware of. And, it's not about studying them or taking an interest in them, but it's important to know these things, to know what the earliest Christians would have thought about these types of things. And I like I said, I think it's just something that's lost. And so in all the conversations that we have about so many things, I think one of the most lost ones is spirituality. A lot of people are afraid to sit down and look at someone and say, there's demons for real, and there's fallen angels for real, and they're for real influencing our world. And I guess my final evidence would be for any Christian who's skeptical, just look around the world at what's going on and see if you think it's by accident. There's a really good movie that I'd recommend. In the first ever video that I did on this channel was a review of this movie. It's called Nefarious, and it sort of presents this worldview. Now, in hindsight, I did a theological analysis of that movie more than a year ago, and there's some things that in hindsight, now that I've kind of developed my view of those things, that I definitely got wrong. And that the movie definitely got wrong, and I don't agree with them anymore. The movie represents sort of the basic view, which is that, like, fallen angels and demons are the same thing, and they all do the same thing, and they're just, like, tempting you and influencing the world. And it's half true. It's more complicated than that, and that's where Michael Heiser's work comes in. It's like, it's more complicated than that. There's a difference between these types of spiritual beings. There's a difference between what a fallen angel and what a demon is, and what they're doing and what they're working on. But the truth of it remains steady, which is that spiritual influence exists in the world, and it's trying to get you to do the wrong thing. And all you need to do is look at the West, look at the United States, and see the state that it's in to see this demonic influence. And if you believe that the United States is not a pagan nation, you're also wrong about that. And the proof is in the pudding. Most Christians can look around and see the absolute de-Christianization and demonization of practices. You know what the people are doing. You know what these people are worshiping. They're worshiping themselves. They're practicing Satanism in the open. It's in our Hollywood. It's in our media. And there's no question to me that paganism is just as prevalent now as it ever was in the course of human history. So if you're interested in more conversations about spirituality and those kind of things, I would be happy to have them. And if you have enjoyed this video, please, like I said, feel free to subscribe, to like. It helps people know that I'm out here making content, and if they're interested, it helps them find me. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.